Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Rice, and I am your podcast host here at Community Therapy. And today we are joined by Jeremie and Andy, who are going to be discussing with us crafting valuable member offerings or community programs, if you will. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves so they can get you familiar with their own community experience and their current communities that they're working in. Jeremie, would you mind introducing yourself first and then passing it over to Andy?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm Jeremy. I've been working in publicly traded and privately held software companies for the past 7 years. I also have a background in social impact, working across organizations like the Peace Corps, IDEO, Amplitude. I was at a GovTech company called Excella. And now I'm leading community for Dovetail. And at these various organizations, I've mostly evaluated community's effectiveness, done member engagement programs, and demonstrated business impact. So that's me in a nutshell. How about
Love
you, Anne? Yeah.
Thanks for the handoff, Jeremy. Hey, I'm Andy. I lead community and ecosystem at Glide. We're a no-code development platform for building apps for work. Been here for about 2 years, looking after all things community. Prior to Glide, was over at GoDaddy for about 7 years. Helped launch their online community program back in 2015. And before that, community was a hobby, gaming stuff, open source software, a lot of things in WordPress, meetups. So yeah, I've been doing this for a little while now.
Oh, amazing. Thank you both for, in a nutshell, introductions for both of your backgrounds. I'm so excited for today's conversation because one question we keep getting from our audience is specifically around crafting member offerings and programs that translate to ROI. And I think both of you have a lot of experience under your belt. So without further ado, let me go ahead and ask our first question, which community is often viewed as support or customer success function, right? At least in the community space when we're talking about building programs for members. But I would be so curious to hear both of your thoughts on how community can be used to generate revenue. So, what do you think about community and generating revenue? How do you see it? Andy, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. So yeah, this is something I spend a little bit too much time thinking about because the team that I sit on at Glide, I'm within the marketing team and the broader go-to-market team. So unlike a lot of online community teams that are focused more on support deflection and support KPIs, I'm thinking about what are we doing to affect the bottom line? How are we thinking about top of funnel? And so there are three main things that I look at when it comes to how are we addressing that. The first one is thinking about community as a sort of comms channel. So when we look at the things that we do, let's say asynchronously through the forums, treating that as a two-way comms channel more so than just, you do an email blast or put things out there. Community, it's more conversational, thinking about it in that respect. Second is what are we doing around community events? So when we're bringing people together, yes, we're thinking mostly about our customers and the existing audience, but it's also can we do events with other people, other products, platforms, partners? These are still community first and community led, but it's more about co-marketing. And then the third one is really looking at what's the sort of byproduct of the things that community does really well. So adjacent to a lot of the KPIs you look at in support and success, where it might be, are we saving money on case deflection? It's also, are we increasing customer value? Are we increasing retention? Like, what are those bottom line numbers that can go back to, or at least be partially influenced by community programs? So, like, if you roll out a new feature and product, how is the adoption of that feature influenced by community activities, and what is that adding to the bottom line? Things like that.
No, things like that. That was
Things like
beautifully
that.
said. Jeremy, what from your experience do you want to add?
Yeah, I really like that overview, and I think it boils
Yeah.
down to whether you're considered a cost center or a revenue generating team, which is something I've navigated more or less effectively in my roles. I think I definitely started out in the support success
Yeah.
realm, showing cost savings. Those metrics aren't ideal because they do include a lot of assumptions. The larger framework that I've adopted at different in different scenarios is really what are those tactics that you're deploying with your community program? How do those ladder up to metrics that show that the community is healthy, growing, active, and you need to build awareness and educate the team and also involve people in setting those metrics. And then the last piece, which is important and often more challenging, is to also just understand how does your workplace make money, whether it's a private company, a nonprofit, a government agency, it comes down to dollars and cents. So understanding how they budget, what the board cares about, what the leadership cares about, and how do you have a clear tie to those top level business goals, and how are you responsive as those evolve? Because the only constant is change. So that's one avenue. You engage stakeholders, build coalitions, make sure that you're adopting new tactics and dropping old ones as the business evolves. The other that I have less experience with is actual membership communities. So communities where you pay people to participate. And I think to your point, Andy, it really boils down to the unique content, conversations, events, rewards. What are those things that you, as an owner of one of these programs, are uniquely positioned to host on an owned channel? Because that's another thing I think through in terms of how a company can drive revenue with community is, do they actually own the data? Do they have participants' emails? Do they is it a LinkedIn post that you're basically borrowing from their platform, or has someone posted unique insights on a channel that you own? That's a huge differentiator, and it has compounding growth because it's the power of networks. It's not just the traditional way of reaching out and engaging customers and prospects that's super linear, like maybe an email campaign or a newsletter. You're actually hosting conversations. So yeah, I'm on the same page as Andy in terms of it's different in every organization, and it takes a lot of intentional planning to
Absolutely.
make sure that your work is in line with what the business is delivering.
And I'm so glad, Jeremie, that you mentioned that community is often seen as a cost center. How would you recommend for folks listening, how can they tie it to revenue? Or how have you tied it to revenue? Maybe more tangible.
Yeah, I could think through some examples. I think in practice, it's really about having those meetings and getting, on the agenda at the executive business review and just sharing what you've learned from the business and
Yeah,
and making sure everyone is aligned, like, hey, I'm spending this much time or the next 3 weeks rolling out this community campaign. Here's how it ties to our goals for the community program, and here's how it aligns with your business. Do you agree, CEO, CFO, CMO?
yeah,
And if you don't have that type of visibility trying to get there, or at least making sure that who you report to is clear and can share that. It's one thing to run a bunch of different tactics. It's another thing to embed them in a business strategy.
yeah,
Um, and I think as community builder, you have to be an expert translator, because you're not only managing the expectations of the members, but you're also communicating the value to different stakeholders within the business. You need to speak the language of product teams, the language of marketing teams, the language of customer success teams, supports teams. Um, so yeah, keeping it pretty high level, that is a higher level thing to consider when you're prioritizing work. It's
yeah.
like, and my recommendation would be to start with the data you have,
Yeah.
uh, which is something I think about a lot in my work, and not to throw a wrench in the conversation, but
Oh, not at
um,
all.
what doesn't get measured doesn't get impacted. And some things that are very important are very difficult to measure, like culture, trust, safety, all these things that the internet and, a lot of tech platforms struggle with are unfortunately not always prioritized because it's hard to measure the value.
It's I love that you touched on that because I think oftentimes as community managers and builders, we sit at that intersection where, yes, we see the business operations, but then we also feel the community. We're interacting with members and we can really better, we're more in tune with that unmeasurable aspect. And so finding ways, I think you said, be an expert translator to then go to your product team or to then go to your executive stakeholders and actually tell them what it is that you innately know from being in your community is such a muscle to build and a very valuable skill. And Andy, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, what I what I found really interesting is how much of our work is advocacy in just one way or another.
Mm.
We, when we show up in the community and we're interacting with customers or users, stakeholders, on that side, we're representing the organization in many ways, especially if you are a community team of one or a couple. You are the face of the organization to a lot of these folks because you're the person that they're speaking to, whereas in many other cases, they're interacting with a brand. You're not a brand, you're a person. You're a member of the community as well as a facilitator of the community. And then going the other way, when you're representing the community internally, you are the voice of your members. And so you need to, I like to call it rattling cages. You're rattling cages on their behalf when if you're hearing things, seeing things in the community, hearing things from members. You need to uh, advocate on their behalf internally with those teams. And to kind of circle back to one of the things that Jeremie led with, uh, tactically, there are a few things that I love doing when I get into an organization. One of the first ones is really thinking about community not as this silo or this island or the shed out back, but really this supporting piece that can touch on so many different teams and organize or parts of the organization. So in those first 30 days, having conversations with as many people as you can from as many different teams as you can to understand what they're working on, what they care about, what KPIs matter to them, and then figuring out how can community tie into those things to show that you are supporting their initiatives and supporting the things that they care about. So it's understanding the business as a whole, but also understanding what motivates these smaller groups and teams of people within the organization, because that relationship is going to pay off in dividends later on when, let's say, you're trying to get the tracking implemented on the analytics and data side to see, for example, are we gathering stats from our community platform in the same place that we're gathering stats from conversion data on the commerce side or on the checkout side for like a SaaS platform, so that we can draw that straight line from folks in the community are spending this much with us, or in these interactions as a whole led to this much of the bottom line in terms of activations or whatever else. And all of that comes back to what are the relationships that you have within the organization and how are you helping them achieve their goals. And it's just that over and over and over again, helping folks internally, helping folks externally. That's what the community is all about. Um, and I think another thing that's really true is when you're talking to executives, the stats and the numbers and the graphs work really well for middle management. When you get up to the executive level, suddenly it's anecdotes, it's stories, and it's being able to talk about an individual and the experience that they have had, and especially these like transformative experiences through the community. Those are the things that resonate at a higher level. And constantly telling those stories over and over again gets you stuck in the head of senior leadership, because now they're like, oh yeah, community, they keep hearing about it, keep hearing about the customers. Don't underestimate the value of that.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a good piece of advice too, because I think sometimes us data nerds in the community space, we really love a graph. We really love a Venn diagram or being able to show the impact more visually. But then to your point, having that member story is also a great opportunity as a community manager to actually shine a spotlight on your members in a way that you're kind of holding them up in a space that they don't even know you're, kind of bragging about their wins in that way. So that kind of has multitudes of impact. That's getting wishy-washy. Okay, so for our next question, and Andy, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off, is what were some of the initial challenges that you faced when identifying, what your community truly wanted, and what they needed? So you talked about your first 30 days.
Mhm.
Once you're meeting with all those folks, how do you start to kind of move through all of that feedback and all of that input?
It's hard. As anyone with experience in community management knows, you're going to have a group of folks who are very vocal. They don't necessarily represent the majority of your community members. And so in the same way that you're in those like first 30 to 60, 90 days, you're talking with the stakeholders internally. What I like to do is try to set up as many, identifying who those passionate people are, the most vocal folks are in the community already, if you're inheriting a community, uh, and set up those one-on-ones with them. Because if they're the ones who are most active in the community, having that rapport, a really strong rapport from the beginning is incredibly beneficial. And then for everybody else, it's kind of like the depth of the conversation gets a little bit lighter, but you're hitting a higher volume. So then you start getting into you're doing these direct messages with community members. Maybe you get into doing polls and surveys at a higher level. And what you're really trying to construct is this big picture of like, here's what we're seeing and hearing from our community overall. Here are some of the stories that we're hearing from our most passionate members. And you're lining that up against the things that you're hearing internally in terms of what the organization cares about. And you're starting to kind of glom everything together and find those common threads. What are the common pain points? What are the things that really matter? What are the priorities? And
Yeah.
then you can start sort of constructing the strategy around that. But it all starts with getting the data, the quantitative data, the qualitative data early on, so that you know you're going in the right direction. And you're not just throwing tactics against the wall.
Absolutely. Jeremie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I 100% agree. The biggest mistake I see community managers make is building out the thing and then hoping people will join or show up. It's super important to identify early adopters, top contributors, give them a distinguished status and take them along for the ride, run workshops, conduct surveys. So anytime I've joined a community, I try to identify those external champions that can help with that process and are excited to contribute because ideally they're excited about the product or service. Internally, I think in your first 90 days, you'd want to get, a prioritized list of goals, evaluating the needs of the team, right? Many of us are teams of one, so you're really like approaching other functions to contribute time and framing it not as, oh my gosh, now we have to do this community thing. It's like, hey, here's how you will benefit through the networked value of our customer base. And then a map of your internal stakeholders. And usually I do a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, just to present out like, here's everything, here's the landscape. In terms of those internal calls on the initial roadshow, trying to gather an initial snapshot of what the current community is or where you're headed if you're launching a new initiative. And then just asking like, what are the current goals in your views? Like you book no more than like 15 minutes with like leaders of each department and just survey them. What would you want to see from this? Do you think everyone agrees on a goal for this initiative? Do we have specific targets for our community? And are these targets based upon data that we actually have access to? So rooting it in the data and the numbers. And then ideally when you're interviewing, senior execs, customer support, customer success, product, sales, even the tech team, marketing. You could even approach legal. I mean, there's a lot to consider. It's not
I
always
would
the
love
best. Yeah,
that.
not always the best for a business to open up two-way dialogue.
Yeah.
So
Laughing in community manager for that one.
yes. So getting all of that data together pretty early on helps root your strategy and also just set expectations.
Yeah.
Hey, I spoke to all these folks and this is what we're starting with and why, keeping into account these potential risks. And to mitigate them, we'll do this, kind of fill out that Mad Lib, and then you have your like strategy.
Ooh, beautiful analogy there with the Mad Lib, because it really is really kind of like that when you're in the midst of it. And both of you touched on both the collecting feedback and then I think one thing that we do hear from listeners, whether it's the podcast or webinars at Hivebrite, is okay, I've collected this feedback and I'm starting to get into the weeds, but how do you actually turn this feedback into a community program? And I know we kind of touched on that lightly a little bit, but would one of you want to kind of jump into that? Now that you have the feedback, you have a clear vision. So we're speaking very abstractly, right? But from your own experience, what does that look like to actually turning it into a program? And either one of you can jump in.
I just have a
Jeremy.
quick word. I
Yeah,
think any community strategy boils down to people, content, technology, and experience. And
beautiful.
within those four buckets, you want to set up like a 30, 60, 90, again, like kind of quarterly roadmap. Under people, it's both your internal stakeholders and your external members. How are you engaging them, keeping them up to date? Is there a, monthly check-in? Is there a regular post externally where you spark conversation? How are you recruiting people to join, and what are your expectations to grow? And are there different groups with different levels of access? So people is a big category. Content is what makes any community hum. You want unique events, videos, blogs, discussions. Technology is the actual platforms that you'll be using. Will you be using Slack? Will you be running it on Zoom? I usually recommend using the tech that you already have access to, as opposed to like rushing into actually purchasing an enterprise community platform. And then finally, the experience is really about journey mapping. And this is something I've been kind of self-learning, is just how to build like end-to-end customer journey maps, from like education and awareness to like has purchased the tool, brought it to 5 companies, and is like a full-fledged advocate and
Yeah.
just diehard fan, right? So people, content, technology, and experience is where my head goes if I'm ever feeling lost.
Oh, that's a beautiful compass. Andy, what are your thoughts?
um Kind of two tactical implementation angles on that.
Yeah.
One is the to the point of the customer journey, thinking about that whole path. So I'm most familiar with like B2B SaaS. That's been my life like the last 20 years. So it's from that first touch awareness all the way through to advocacy and word of mouth referrals, that sort of thing. All of those phases of the customer journey, where does community tie in? What things can we do through community experiences? And that encompasses pretty much all the things, but what things can we do to support those different phases of the customer journey? And that's a really fun exercise just for brainstorming.
Yeah.
And then the second one is when you're thinking about what are those actual activities and experiences, I always just come back to the basic stuff of like who, what, where, when, why. Who are we doing this for? What are we doing together? When are we doing it? Where are we doing it? Is it going to be online, offline? What platform are we using, and why? Like, what is the thing that we're supporting here? And then you end up with a lovely table. And it's just like, here are the phases, here are the activities, and here are the details. And you can really drill down in there. But then when you're thinking about for those activities, also considering, well, what's the effort required? What's the overhead on resources here? And then to Jeremy's point, what's the minimum viable version of this that we can test the waters with? So before we go out and say, we're going to start a new series and every week we're doing this, it's like, can we do one? Can we do one just to test the waters? And if it goes well, can we do it again? And kind of taking that approach for everything just to be safe, because I know I'm guilty of this. I've done it way too many times where
Absolutely.
you get really excited to go in and start a new community initiative, and then you realize like one or two iterations in, oh, this is a lot harder than I thought it was, or this isn't getting the uptake that I thought it would. And then you have to pivot, and now you have a bit of egg on your face because it's like, well, we said that this was going to be an ongoing thing. We made a big proclamation, and there was design work done, and it's a series, and there's a landing page. Don't hurt yourself that way. Just keep it small to start with and go from there.
Keep it simple, keep it small. And I think it
Yeah.
also creates more room for members too, even though we want the big flashy thing, right?
Give them
Jeremie,
the opportunity to steer it, right?
yeah, Jeremie, I saw you nodding your head. Was there anything you wanted to add to what Andy shared?
Yeah, I found myself caught like either in analysis paralysis where you're not iterating fast enough, and then when you're in that state, kind of just doing something really helps. But on the other side of the spectrum, um, the urge or the desire, like you have to just throw away your inner perfectionist and just co-create. It's going to be messy. It's going to go not go how you expected, but that's kind of the excitement of co-creation.
I like that framing a lot. And I think it kind of ties a little bit to our next question, Jeremie. So I'm glad you shared that. So when we are, as community managers, looking to effectively communicate value or programming, but then also trying to communicate ROI to leadership specifically now. So let's say we've already launched this hypothetical program in a community. How do you then take those findings, and we kind of touched on this in the beginning, but how do you take those initiatives, your outcomes, and really find a way to make it tangible or to speak to your leadership team? So those benefits might not be immediately tangible. For example, from community builders, we'll hear, okay, to Andy's point, we've launched this initiative and we've had a few iterations of it, and because you're maybe sitting in the revenue team, you're having that pressure applied, and because as a community manager in the community, you see that it's having an impact. And I think you touched on this earlier, Jeremie, where you're not necessarily able to quantify it. What would your advice be to a community manager in a position like that?
Yeah, I would say I can think to an example. I was working at an ed tech company a couple years ago where I actually was one of the few roles where I didn't inherit an existing community. I had to launch a net new one and really own the initiative end to end. Sat in a marketing team, worked really closely with sales. Um, Classic kind of rookie problem I encountered is I was just doing too much. So I launched an advocacy program, which ties to revenue in a sense that you're, building a database of referenceable customers and using those references to help close deals. There was an education aspect. I was like maintaining an LMS and like running experts through certification programs. And I owned all of those education programs, which technically fell under community, which was great. Um, there was also gamification and rewards that I rolled out, which is a huge undertaking. And the idea is you drive engagement through a point system, and we had a whole platform set up that would also automatically send swag. So I was like setting up a warehouse in Arizona through this
Yeah.
vendor. Uh, and then I was also
I
maintaining
love
the
the
web.
dream.
Yeah.
Living the dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also had a roster of these, certified champions that we'd feature on our website, and I maintained the website and that page. So you can see how I think Brene Brown says clarity is kindness, like not having that clarity from the top down and not going in with like a clear focus
Yeah.
not only, results in burnout, which is a big problem in our industry, but also in terms of effectively communicating value and ROI. Um, when you're doing all of that, how can you carve out the time to create the like Q1 update with the latest dashboard and the reporting that you were describing earlier, Andy, of like the data for the middle managers and then the cool stories, screenshotting the customer saying this is the best certification program I've ever had. So I was able to kind of luckily be self-aware enough before I hit burnout to sync with some of the leaders and really rally around a conference series that we run, because the at the time a big business imperative was to just get more leads into the pipeline. So we ran an entire volunteer-led conference series, at over 12K, new, contacts in our database. That was a very tangible way for me to level set, kind of adjust. I ramped down some of the other programs that were very valuable, but maybe less tied to the immediate needs of the business, and got everyone involved in this conference series over 2 years, which had a great impact. And tangibly, I run an external survey, like a pulse check once every quarter or maybe twice a year, to understand who members are, how they feel about the program, is it helping them meet their goals, and then what's going well and what can be improved. And then in any kind of reporting, it's really just about listing those goals and then how you're tracking against them, and then the timeline for the next 3 months. And so ideally every quarter you're setting goals, aligning with the team, and executing a manageable amount of tactics to move the needle on those metrics that matter.
I relate so much to your tidbit about a warehouse, in the sense of like when I was a community builder in the nonprofit space, I spent so much time on a swag program, and so that just
That's been
resonated.
my life for the last 3 months.
Yeah.
Has been, I gotta say, like, if community management and being a community professional, if you consider yourself a generalist, there really is no other role or industry that is as generalist friendly as community management. Because one day you're a guidance counselor, the next day you're out doing logistics and fulfillment, and trying to figure out, like, why are there restrictions in the EU on these types of products while in North America there isn't. Like, it is such a wide spectrum of things you'll learn about. It's great.
Oh, absolutely, Andy. Andy, before we move on to the next question, is there anything you want to add to what Jeremy's shared, or even from your own experience as well?
For sure. Jeremy hit on pretty much everything,
Yeah.
but I just want to give a couple examples of going from the stuff I was doing at GoDaddy, so like large enterprise, to what I'm doing now, Glide, startup, less than 50 people. Community is like a fraction of what I do, but I'm wholly responsible for it. So it's two very different experiences. At GoDaddy, the initial setup, building those relationships with different teams, because you have like a bunch of teams that look after analytics and a bunch of teams that look after finance or procurement. Like, those relationships really matter. So at the beginning, it was get a lot of the infrastructure in place, and that's going to take quite a long time compared to when you're in a smaller company. But once those things are set up, being able to get the table stakes in place of, like, we got the analytics, we can get the reporting and the tracking and all of those things turned on so that it's always available, so that when it comes time to do your weekly reports, which could just be like a Slack update to your direct manager, say, here's what we did last week, here's what we're doing this week, here are the KPIs for last week. Those are coming from the same place that you're pulling for, like, when you're doing a team update, here's what we did for the last month, to a department update of here's what we did for the last quarter, to a larger corporate update of, like, here's how the first half of the year went. All of those things come from the same place. And
Mhm.
so you're kind of doing like a compound interest on your work of, like, all those weekly updates roll up to the quarterly, to the biannual. Now, doing all of that stuff where you're preparing reports and decks, and you're going to front load with stuff that the executives care about, but then you got to make sure you have the data in the appendices, because if they have questions, you need to have answers ready like that, or you're in trouble. That is very different from when you're in a startup. If the startup is like, no, we need to move fast, we need to iterate, we need to figure things out because we're just trying to find the right direction. It took me a while to get out of the mode of every month I need to have a PowerPoint deck or a pitch deck ready, to week over week. It's just, here are the KPIs. for last week. Here are the KPIs for last week. And you're just focusing much more on the execution rather than on the reporting. The common thread through that is that you have the data ready to pull when called upon. You don't need to necessarily be as proactive and do as much volume in the reporting, but you need to have the information there and ready so that when you are asked, you can get an answer, and you can get an answer quickly. So I think that is the most important thing for like justifying anything you want to do, is being able to say, and here's why, and having those numbers ready to go, or just the information ready to go.
Yeah,
So that's that.
absolutely. Yeah, that's that. Perfect. And thank you both so much for providing examples of your own experience too, because I think that is super valuable. Okay, so we have 3 more questions left, and we'll kind of bundle the last 2, I think. So the first being, could you provide some insights into key milestones or turning points that marked success in your community revenue models? So that's at a higher level. And then the other is, how do you balance the needs of wanting your community members to have, I think Jeremy, you already touched on this, but how can you balance the need of your members, the needs and wants, desires of members, with also your own bandwidth, meaning both bandwidth as a community manager, but also financially. So I think those two kind of integrate really well. And I wanted to create the space where we can have a larger conversation when it comes to, okay, now that you've launched your program, you're starting to report on it. What are some key milestones that you think stand out just as a community manager? And then how do you balance this ongoing program that you've now created with bandwidth and burnout, to Jeremy's point earlier, in mind, while also keeping finances top of mind, right, with ROI? And Andy, if you wouldn't mind taking us off.
Sure. Okay. So starting first part,
Yeah,
we're talking about the milestones, right?
absolutely, please.
Okay, for sure. So there are a couple of big ones for each of my experiences at GoDaddy and now Glide. At GoDaddy, I think one of the big ones was uh, building a really strong relationship with the engineering teams, like the platform teams, engineering, analytics, because once we were able to get what we were doing in community tied into platform, it made community so much more effective. Uh, that was single sign-on, so the ability to authenticate into the community. We did this early on because it was such a high priority. You're authenticating it with the same login you're using to log into your customer account. That was huge. Um, when we were running analytics on the same universal platform that the rest of the organization is running on, so that you could look at someone who comes into the community and then they go to some community attributed content like blog posts written by community members or community champions, and then they go to the website and then they transact and then they upgrade, and you're seeing that whole path that kicked off with somebody came into the community or interacted with content that came out of the community. Those were huge because the compound of that was being able to say, look at the actual revenue, look at the e-commerce transactions that are configured in Google Analytics. Here's how much revenue can be attributed to or influenced or was influenced by the community and our programs, and that was substantial. And that is something that I just kept coming back to, and even now it's like, to me, that is the North Star. Like, can you get things lined up to that level where you can just point and say, look at the results we're driving. For Glide, I think the biggest milestone for us was very much on the other side, which was more about talking to our best customers. And this was a thing that we did last year when I think there were some questions among some folks on the team of like, how valuable is the community to the business? And bless my colleagues, they're amazing for going and doing this work. They did the legwork on like video calls and big surveys to our customers, asking like, what is the value of the community to you? And the overwhelming response was, this is a huge part of why I decided to use Glide, why I got started with Glide, how I succeeded with Glide. It was because the community helped me in all these ways. And now the question of like, is community valuable? We don't even ask it anymore. We know it's valuable because we did all that work. And I think that there's so much strength in those stories, where it's just kind of, it's just canon now within the
Yeah.
organization. It's like community, of course, we're not going to question that. Because last time we got the evidence that, like, no, it's part of the business, it's part of the experience. Um, and I think those two combined is like, if you can hit on both of those things with your community program, here are the numbers, and then here are the stories and the actual what people are saying. You're in a really, really good spot.
Oh, that is so inspirational too. Being able to get the the metrics. I think so many of us struggle with that, right? As community managers of like, how do you show from point A to point B? And then also being able to have your team contribute to helping to create that canon. Was that something that your team did organically, or was that something led by you and with their help? Just curious.
It was largely spearheaded by them, because I was already bringing the anecdotes,
Right.
but there we do have a very big data driven kind of
Yeah.
engineering centric culture at Glide, which was great. Let's
Yeah.
back that up with some real data. Uh, to that first point on the GoDaddy side about getting those numbers, all of that comes back to building those relationships in the first place. Make
Yep.
Mm.
friends with the engineering team, make friends with the platform team, whether it's you're doing a platform migration and you need help on URL redirects to preserve the organic search traffic that you're getting.
Yeah.
You want friends on the platform team, analytics, friends on the platform team, uh, friends in legal, friends in finance. Be like besties with as many different core groups in the organization as possible. Um, it is so crucial, and a lot of that comes down to personal relationships. So just wanted to add extra emphasis there. I'm done.
Love the emphasis. Jeremy, what are your thoughts? And let me know if you want me to kind of hit on the key points again.
Yeah, I would say SSO has always been a huge unlock because then you can tie your community to product signups and also identify, um, get a little more advanced in comparing members versus non-members, right?
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that stood out for me in my career has been integrating the community with the CRM of choice at the company. So being able to have a campaign in Salesforce or, Zoho or other CRMs where you can attribute a lead, an account to community activity, and also surfacing those content conversations, event participation to add more context around the customer contact so that the sales and CS team are really empowered to leverage the community in a way that puts value first. So you're reaching out with more context and doing it more authentically. I think the last piece that I would speak to is expectations management. And I think the question has a little bit of a is alluding to a tension between what your community members want, what the business wants, what you actually deliver. A lot of that, and would love to learn from others, but a lot of how I've managed that is I literally just create kind of like you would manage a product. You're going in sprints and you release or try out different community features, programs, and I just create a backlog of this is everything that the team internally has requested. This is everything that our members are requesting. Here's where that aligns, and here's what we are prioritizing at this current point in the business for these reasons. And just having that posted somewhere in Notion, your internal wiki, and then having a version that's customer facing, where you're providing those core members a regular update about where the program is at so that they're bought in and understand why their request XYZ is not happening right now.
Mm.
So yeah, some sort of backlog or board and anticipated timelines goes a really long way.
Oh, I love that tip so much, especially since since community members are very passionate and they want to see a program succeed, and being able to give them that transparency of, hey, we hear you, and actually, we've added it to this space could be a really great way for those listening. Andy, any thoughts on what Jeremy just shared? I know you put in the chat hierarchy.
Yeah, I put it in our chat because I think Jeremy called it out so well. It's this hierarchy of community needs. And there's going to be a hierarchy of needs for the members, and there's going to be a hierarchy of needs for the organization. And in many ways, what we're doing when we run community programs is we're acting a lot like a product manager. And we need to look at what are those different competing feature requests and stories that are coming in, and we have to make a judgment call based on available resources and bandwidth, what makes the cut. I think that in all of our community programs, there is definitely a core set of things and expectations that are non-negotiable. Like there are certain things that the community exists to do that you always have to make sure you're fulfilling those needs. And then everything else is kind of a sliding scale of, is this essential or is it a nice to have? And those core things I would dig my heels in on with the organization, but everything else is kind of up for negotiation. And that's where that's what you're there for, is figuring out what trade-offs can we make, do we need to make. Sometimes you need to pull back on community initiatives to really fulfill needs on the organization side, but then by doing so, that makes it easier for you to then go back and fulfill those initiatives on the community side. It's a give and take constantly, but that's why we're there as community leaders.
And I would add, in kind of orchestrating all of this, if there are initiatives that you or your team doesn't have bandwidth for, if a team wants to take that on,
Mm-hmm.
or it makes sense for someone's career growth that they'd want to do some sort of initiative in the community,
That's a really good call out.
I'm always looking for ways to delegate and get people excited, and because it is very much there's an infinite amount of work when you're building a community, and you could really just scale it or do less. Both are fine.
I think I want to hit on that a little bit more, because I know some folks are very protective of the community, where it's like community is this kind of sanctum, and you don't want to, like, nobody else can post in there, no one else can interact with the community, everything has to go through me as like the community manager. Other folks are much more, the community is a shared resource. It's great for others to come in and participate and lead initiatives and be members of the community too, within, there are guidelines and parameters and things that we're going to put in place. I'm very much a fan of the latter. I love it when I see other members of the team show up in community discussions, because if they're doing that, to me it shows that they're seeing the value of the community. They see that it's worthwhile participating and getting involved. And if more folks in the team see the community as a shared resource and just part of the organization, then that's better for everybody. It's better for the community programs, it's better for the members. Everybody kind of wins when you embrace that.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk with you both about this for hours, but unfortunately, we're already to our last question. So, any closing thoughts before we kind of kick off with our last and kind of more fun question? Although all of this has been fun. Okay, so our last question to both of you is, what community program are you most proud of that you've started? And it can be any time in your career as community builders. And we would love to just kind of hear more about what's been your passion community program or project. And Jeremie, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Yeah, just as a closing thought, I'm happy to put myself out there as a resource for anyone looking into community building as a career. In terms of my journey, that same company I was alluding to earlier in the ed tech space, I had a 2-year stint working with educators. And I'll say that that community was near and dear to my heart. I started my career as an educator in the Peace Corps. And so really haven't always had that degree of empathy with the members running different professional communities. And I actually launched that community the day I pressed, publish and like launched the whole instance was the day we went into lockdown. So it was like a very crazy time. It was great for my metrics. I had like
Fantastic metrics.
10,000 people join. But it was a wild ride. And I think it was the first gig where I learned that balance of learning the business, how to tie the conversation we've been having today is really where that sunk in. I'm like, oh, okay, like you need to understand business to do well in this field. So it's been ongoing learning since then.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Do you mind where I ask where you served for Peace Corps?
Oh, I was in China for 2 years.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And wow, what an amazing time to launch our community.
I mean, it was 5 years ago at this point, which is
Yeah,
three
Oh
years.
boy.
time is an
Yeah.
illusion and over to you.
One, I don't know how to beat that. And two, 5 years ago, was it that? It feels like
Maybe
it was
four.
last year. Like, oh my goodness. Oh boy, what is time? Um, so for me, very different. There was a little meetup group back in the town I went to college in called college. I went to college in Kingston, Ontario, home to Queen's University, St. Lawrence College. And there was a small meetup group called the Limestone New Media Group. It was the first meetup group I had ever been part of. But that was the thing that got me really thinking about community management as a profession. So, a friend of mine was doing community management for a podcasting platform. I think it was called TalkShoe. Um, Back in the day, this would have been like 2008, 2007. And from that, when I moved to Toronto, I joined the WordPress meetup group, which led me to doing WordCamps at conferences and meeting WordPress meetup organizers from around North America. That led me into to GoDaddy. Like all of these things happened in my career, and community became a career out of that little chill meetup group where we just met in a coffee shop once a week talking about all this newfangled stuff of podcasting and social media and hey, who has an iPhone now? Like all these things were so new. Uh, and fast forward a whole bunch of years, and here we are with community being a full-on, growing, thriving profession. Uh, I owe it all to them. So
Well, I
shout
love
out.
that. Shout out. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you for all of our listeners for make sure to check out the show notes. We're going to put some links over to Jeremie and Andy and any of the resources that we mentioned. And thank you so much for listening to Community Therapy.